I'm Alice Mulder. I'm a professor in the geography department here at Weber State, and I'm also directing this new sustainability center that our president mentioned this morning. So I'm very excited to be at the summit again this year, and pleased to be finding more out about food. We're actually having a year-long series on our campus looking at food issues, kind of across the campus, across the disciplines. So it's a great topic for us. So we're going to get started, and we have a team presenting today, or a pair presenting today. Some folks are coming in. If you're on an edge or want to scooch over so we can get in, that might be kind. I think a lot of people are wending their way back from the vendors. How's lunch? Oh, thank you. So we have Bridget Stuckley here, who is from Salt Lake City Green, and she is the program manager for the Salt Lake City's Division of Sustainability. She manages the city's community garden and fruit share programs and facilitates the Salt Lake City Food Policy Task Force. Particularly as facilitator of that task force, she has worked to create and advance food policy and programs that strengthen the local food system. She's been involved in conducting a community food assessment to look at challenges and opportunities for a more resilient, accessible, and equitable food system. Ms. Stuckley has over 10 years of experience in researching, coordinating, and promoting environmentally sustainable practices to an array of audiences, businesses, residences, municipalities. She has earned a bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Colorado at Boulder, which is where I did my graduate work, fabulous place to be. And she studied the benefits of sustainable agriculture in Costa Rica, working in the field there through Boston University School for Field Studies. The second presenter who will be presenting with Ms. Stuckley is Tyler Polson, also Salt Lake City Green. He joined the Salt Lake City Sustainability Team in November 2013. Prior to that, he spent 4 years working on energy and sustainability with Park City Municipal. Tyler's job responsibilities focus on mitigating municipal and community carbon footprints. He's been involved with projects in the areas of energy efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, transportation, waste and recycling, and community outreach. He's got a master's in economics with a focus on environmental economics from the University of Utah, and holds the LEED Green Associate certification accreditation. So please join me in welcoming them. And why do you talk to us at the end? How do you?
Maybe at the end.
Yeah, so we'll keep questions till the end. Great.
Okay, thanks. So I guess I wanted to start by describing the range of emotions that Bridget and I had as we approached today and really this presentation. And it really started with just a lot of excitement in terms of the potential to present on food choices and the impacts that they have on environmental, social, and economic systems. But that excitement quickly kind of turned to feeling overwhelmed as we really got into breaking down what we would and would not cover during the presentation. So I think we pulled together something that's cohesive, though, and kind of respects the general consensus in science around food choices, but at the same time would kind of ask for some leeway if we don't cover topics to the depth that you would like or miss certain topics. But with that, what we will talk about today is I'll start by speaking about climate change, Salt Lake City, and then also the household footprint, the household carbon footprint. The keynote presenter today, Professor Orr, talked about climate change being a linchpin issue in so many areas. And I've heard it described similarly by a climate scientist as being the challenge that just supersedes everything in terms of social, environmental, economic, and certainly with a big food element. So I'll get into that. Bridget's going to talk a little bit about following the food system and some of the life cycle impacts, stories, and considerations around food. And then I'll get to psychology of personal and consumer choice. And then I'll also talk very briefly about a very specific and potentially disruptive model emerging in the food sector. And then near the end, Bridget's going to talk about food policies and programs and provide some historical perspective and very national level perspective around the U.S. and food policies and programs. And then we hope to close with some discussion and Q&A. So starting on the climate topic, this is a graphic that probably everyone is acquainted with on some level, but as you know, the global temperature is warming. Land and ocean temperatures are warming, and when you track that over the course of a decade, every single decade is warmer than the preceding one on a global level. To kind of put that in perspective, the last time the global average temperature was cooler than the 20th century average was 38 years ago. So Saturday Night Fever was not even in theaters at that time, and we've had 38 consecutive years of the global average temperature being above the 20th century average. So it's clear that it's not climate change, the climate has changed. We're in a new climate system in its entirety. But what does that mean to us locally? Earlier today we heard Professor Schultz talk about temporal biases and also spatial biases. Over time and over distance creates a disconnect between people and their sense of fear and topics and those sorts of things. So I thought it was appropriate that we would start with a more local example. So in the case of Utah, over the course of the 20th century, we warmed at about 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So warmer or a quicker pace of warming than the national average. But I think where the data really gets interesting is when you look at the rate of change since 1970, where the 4 decades since 1970, the rate of change for Utah has been about 3 times what it was for the 20th century average. And so we've seen an uptick in warming, and it's documented in a variety of reports and whatnot. One other important thing to note whenever I see a temperature graphic like this is, we're talking about the concept of global warming. We want to respect that, what that means in terms of the entire globe. The continental U.S. itself covers about 1.58% of the total area of the planet. So it's really a small percentage of what is a global phenomenon. And so it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about local temperature deviations, variations year to year, month to month. When you hear about snow in Boston and cold temperatures there, really putting that in perspective in terms of the global context and what's occurring and how those trends are manifesting versus what's happening on a very local, small pixel of the planet at any given time. But for Utah, along with the global average temperatures in Utah have been rising. What this graphic is, it's a 60-month running mean of average temperature for the state of Utah. So what that means is each data point represents 5 years worth of data put into a single average point to reflect more of a climate trend rather than a year-over-year temperature trend. And so things are warming, and as you can see, we are riding well above the 20th century average in terms of temperatures in Utah. But to bring this down to even a more local context and really, on a personal level, remove some of that spatial and temporal bias, I thought one thing I would do is I would look at, well, what was the temperature like when I was born? I can't remember what it was like when I was born. I can't remember what it was like 10 years ago. So I thought I would create a graphic using some of the National Climatic Data Center information about Salt Lake City temperatures in the first 12 months of my life. And so I did that, and that's what is represented here on this graphic, starting in April 1981, all the way through March 82. To add a bit more of a climate perspective, not really climate, I took the first 3 years of data so that we just don't have one outlier year really overriding any of the trends. And I averaged those into a 3-year average beginning in April 1981. And then I took the most recent 3 years of climate data for Salt Lake City. And what that kind of revealed was that in 11 of the 12 months, it has been warmer in the most recent 3 years, and the 3 years, my first 3 years here on the planet. The 1 month that's an abnormality here, January, is kind of an interesting case. January 2013 for Salt Lake City is the coldest month in the temperature record since 1949. Coldest single month. And there's a variety of reasons for that, cold Arctic air, those sorts of things. So if you're, writing that, if you're putting all your eggs in that basket, that every year is going to be warmer in your specific locale, and that's going to be your justification for climate change or global warming, you're going to be disappointed at some point. And we see that with the Salt Lake City temperature. But overall, things have changed. The climate shifted here, and it is warmer. The months I highlighted here, May through July, those 3 months are about 5.1 degrees warmer in the most recent 3 years than my first 3 years here. So that's a current context. Another thing I wanted to do on climate was think about going forward. What's the future going to look like in Salt Lake City? And so there's a tool online that a site called Climate Central's developed where they take a lot of the published research and materials and they turn them into interactive tools that are interesting. And so they looked at if emissions trends continue at their current rate, what are the summer months going to look like? What is the average high temperature for the summer months going to look like in your city? So I typed in Salt Lake City, and for us, at the end of this current century, we're going to be comparable to current day Catalina Foothills, Arizona. Didn't know where that was. I looked it up. It turns out it's right near Tucson. And so that kind of got me thinking, wow, it's quite a shift. What does that mean for Tucson? If we're Tucson, then what's Tucson? Click on Tucson's Abu Dhabi. And so there's clearly a lot at stake when it comes to emissions and emissions trajectories and these type of things. And I looked at St. George in the tool as well, and they're actually a little warmer than Tucson. So their future summers are going to be at 111 degrees, and put them somewhere in Saudi Arabia. So climate change obviously tied to greenhouse gas emissions and the importance of those. This is a representation of, on a community level, what Salt Lake City's carbon footprint looks like: electricity, natural gas, those sorts of things. And so it's a very informative graphic, and it helps frame policy and that type of thing. But ultimately, on an individual level, on a household level, it's pretty boring, and it's not really actionable for any individual person or household. And so one thing I did years ago, about 7 years ago, when I was still in graduate school, I did a thesis on the Utah household footprint and researching cost-effective ways that households in Utah mitigate their footprint. And so the first component of that research was to analyze the areas where our emissions come from. So looking at home energy, so electricity, natural gas, and some in-home propane use, looking at transportation, both on-road and air travel, and then also dietary choices and quantifying those and coming up with an aggregate footprint for the average Utah household. And so it turns out that if you look at these categories, and this doesn't include energy used in the workplace, it doesn't include energy associated with durable goods, clothes, those sorts of consumer goods, those types of things, but just among these categories, the average Utah household emits about 81,000 pounds of CO2 annually. And so to put that in, I guess, layman's terms, that's about 4,200 gallons of fuel worth of emissions. And to put that into more layman's terms, that's the equivalent of jumping in a Toyota Prius and driving from Logan to Las Vegas every single day of the year. That's the emissions of a 3.07 person Utah household on an annual basis. So, we're part of a much bigger economic, social machine that's great at burning carbon and using it for energy and using it for a lot of constructive purposes. And the household really is a microcosm of that and a reflection of that. Within the household, the dietary choices impact is something that really stuck out to me 7 or 8 years ago when I started looking into this, and seeing that 25% of the impact was associated with dietary choices. And so when it came to some of the thesis work, I was looking at a variety of things around home energy, transportation, and all these different ways, cost-effective ways, to reduce emissions across these categories. And one of the best I found was eating a vegetarian diet, reducing the consumption of red meat. And so you can kind of see here, it trumps all these things. Just eating a vegetarian diet 3 days a week from the baseline reduces emissions about 3,500 pounds a year. So a substantial reduction. Another piece of information I encountered around this time was a study out of Carnegie Mellon, where it was revolving around food miles and the role that food miles play in creating greenhouse gas emissions. They looked at the life cycle of animals and footprints and those things, and food miles and what that meant. And so they then quantified different types of actions that a household could make and what that would translate into over the course of a year. And so one thing that stuck out, just purely from a greenhouse gas perspective, it wasn't as important where the food product came from as much as what you were doing. So you can kind of see buying 100% local will reduce your footprint or just over 900 pounds, replacing red meat and dairy with vegetable-based products, 8,200 pounds. It's 9 times the impact. And so, I want to just stress that strictly from a greenhouse gas perspective doesn't include all the other factors. You heard from Professor Orr this morning about the multiplier effect, the importance of spending dollars locally, all those other things. Those need to be weighed in, but this is also a striking result to consider. And so with that, we're just going to get into a little bit more of the food system and talking about life cycle.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about was just to define the food system. What is a food system? And essentially what that is the entire life cycle of a food product from production to plate to food waste. And as you can see, that includes everything in between with transportation, packaging, even food waste. And what we know about the life cycle of food is that there's a lot of opportunities, obviously, for emissions to be emitted. But some of the largest areas where we're seeing greenhouse gas emissions are actually coming in the production sector. So 50% in the United States of our greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food system happen before that food product even leaves the farm. And the rest of it, the life cycle, accumulates the other 50%. And so that varies depending on what food product we're talking about. And to delve a little deeper into that, I have this graphic. And so what this is illustrating in green are the production emissions that come from the food product. And then in orange, you'll see the post-farm gate emissions that are associated with each food product. Post-farm gate includes everything from processing, transportation, retailing, cooking, and waste disposal. As you can see, with specific meat products, a lot of that impact is really happening at the farm. And then it kind of dissipates a little as you get further down the food chain. But some really interesting things to consider when we're looking at our food choices. And a way that we can kind of conceptualize that a little bit more is through this great graphic through Environmental Working Group. How many people have seen this already? Just a handful. Okay. So basically what the Environmental Working Group did was look at the entire life cycle of food products and translate that into the equivalent of vehicle miles driven. So for 4 ounces of each of these food products that are outlined here, you have the equivalent of how many miles driven. As you can see, maybe, I'm not sure how well you can see in the back, but not all meat is created equal. These bottom 3 worst emitters include lamb, beef, and cheese. And then chicken actually comes a little further down here after salmon. And then of course when you get into some of the grains, that's in the middle. And then we get into some of the plant-based food proteins, milk, and some other options. And this is part of what's called the Meat Eater's Guide. And it's a really cool document that was put together by Environmental Working Group if you want to learn more about it and look at some of the resources that go along with that. So globally, agriculture accounts for anywhere between 19 and 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And that varies a little bit depending on the methodology that's used, but also how much of the life cycle these different studies are including. The largest emitter within the agricultural system comes from what's called enteric fermentation. Essentially, this is just really inefficient digestion by ruminant animals, so that's cows, lambs, sheep. They just aren't designed to digest anything really well. So they create a lot of methane when they're digesting, and essentially that the methane that's emitted, the greenhouse gas emissions of methane as they relate to agriculture, account for 35% of our global greenhouse gas or methane emissions. And so the reason that's important is because methane has 30 times the global warming potential as CO2. So it warms the planet 30 times faster than CO2 does. Next, you'll see that manure is often a problem as well. That contributes to methane as well, and synthetic fertilizers are a big contributor to nitrous oxide. In fact, agriculture nitrous oxide emissions are 65% of all nitrous oxide emissions globally. And that's a problem because nitrous oxide has 300 times the global warming potential as CO2. So this really dynamic graphic of Utah is supposed to illustrate, created in paint by yours truly, it's supposed to illustrate how much forest we're losing on an annual basis. It's essentially 3/4 of the size of Utah is removed annually to convert to agricultural land. That's also the equivalent of 38 football fields per minute. So it's a substantial impact. And this is a really cool graphic. So this is something that NASA pulled together. And when we talk about agricultural land conversion or agricultural practices, we have to talk about fire. And so this is basically a satellite image of fire that happens over a consecutive 10-day period. And what you'll see is the red dots indicate where the fire is not as hot, and the yellow is going to be the most intense fires. So these are fires just over the course of a 10-day period. And the reason that's a problem is because 90% of the fires that happen globally are started by humans in order to convert that agricultural land or to get rid of agricultural debris on our fields. And it's a huge problem because anywhere from 50 to 60% of those fires end up burning out of control and destroying a lot more forest or savanna area than is intended. And where that's a really large problem is in areas where there's boreal forest, like Russia, because those boreal forests account for 37% of our carbon sequestration globally. So if you're burning those, you're really releasing a lot of carbon emissions that are being sequestered, which can have a pretty huge impact. There's other impacts, of course, related to the way that we're using land. There's a lot of monoculture, and we're essentially using 2/3 of the crops that we're producing to feed animals when we could be using that to feed 1 billion people. And one way to think about that is if we were to reduce our meat consumption, or I should say our grain-fed meat consumption, by 50%, it would be enough additional calories to feed 2 billion people. And one of the other consequences of industrial agriculture is runoff. And the reason that's an issue is because industrial agriculture is really intensive. It really relies a lot on nitrogen fertilizer. And that's a problem because as it runs off, it creates what's called eutrophication, or nitrogen or nutrient loading into our waterways. So in the United States alone, there's 35,000 miles of 22 rivers that is polluted by agricultural pollutants and runoff related to nitrogen fertilizers and manure. So why is that a problem? I mean, aside from the pollution, it's also a problem because it creates these dead zones. So the Mississippi becomes kind of a collector for all of this runoff. It feeds into the Gulf of Mexico, and what you're seeing here is what's considered the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico. Essentially where there's been so much nutrient loading that there's algae blooms, and the area is what's called hypoxic, or just devoid of oxygen. So it kills marine life, it doesn't sustain anything, and it's a huge problem. This is another impact of our food system right here. So this graphic indicates water use by using bathtubs. So your typical bathtub has around 37 gallons of water in it. So beef, as you'll see, you don't have to count all those bathtubs, I did it for you. It's 111 bathtubs per one, and this is kilogram, so 2.2 pounds of beef. Cheese comes in around 36, and then the rest, the math gets a little easier as you go down. But you can see that you can also make a substantial difference by substituting beer for milk. So I wanted to distill that down even a little bit further to bring you to one of these quintessential American as you can see here, there's a lot of emissions associated with this cheeseburger, but by far the largest is the beef, and coming in second is the cheese. And so the equivalent, or the total impact is 11.42 pounds of CO2, which is the equivalent of driving roughly 13 miles. So if you were able to switch to a veggie burger, it would only be the equivalent of driving 3.5 miles in terms of carbon emissions. And then water, again, is kind of obscene. 698 gallons of water to make a single cheeseburger. So that accounts water throughout the entire life cycle of production, obviously, and processing, animal hydration, that sort of thing. So there's some pretty substantial impacts, and especially when we think of what our climate projections are around water, these are important figures to keep in mind. With that, I'll turn it back over to Tyler to kind of delve a little deeper into why we make certain food choices.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we make certain food choices. I don't know how people actually get the psychology, though. There's a lot out there, and one of the first resources I encountered was an annual report called Menus of Change. It's co-published by the Culinary Institute of America and the Harvard School of Public Health. And so if you're looking for a great synthesis of attitudes and motivations behind food choices, I would highly recommend this report. But one thing really stuck out to me in reading it, and that was when they poll consumers about sustainability, 84% of people say that they consider sustainability in their food choices. So 84% say they consider sustainability. But then when they ask, do you incorporate social or environmental considerations into your ultimate choices around food, 26% said that they actually do incorporate choices. So there's this disconnect between considering something and then actually having that translate into action. And it brought to mind a concept I heard where I heard someone talking about exactly this point. They were saying it's a pretty sizable distance between the head and the heart, between understanding something and really, really understanding it and embodying it. And it's even greater distance between the heart and the hand, or the heart and the fork in this case. And so the research here in the Harvard study added weight to that concept. I also came across some polling over time done by Gallup in terms of the number of Americans that consider themselves vegetarian or not. And starting in 1999 all the way to 2012, it's really not moving much. I think that in order to really delve into the data, you would need something other than a Gallup poll, which is just a blanket statement to say, okay, are you eating more plant-based options? Are you considering less red meat? Are you those types of things? But just on its surface, this very basic question, do you consider yourself to be a vegetarian or not? There actually isn't much movement in the U.S. And I found that unbelievable a little bit at first, and then I went and looked at a number of other studies, and everything I could find validated this roughly 5% figure. One of the things I encountered was a report published last year by the Humane Research Council, and they deemed this report to be the most comprehensive study ever of former and current vegetarians. And in their number, actually, they're saying it's more like 2% of the U.S. population is a current vegetarian. In fact, there's about 5 times as many former vegetarians than current vegetarians, according to their research. And so their goal was to really delve into the psychology and the priorities of a current vegetarian versus former. And so they created an infographic for profile of a former vegetarian. It has things like the person disliked sticking out in the crowd. They didn't have sufficient interaction with other vegetarians. They did not see it as part of their identity. And that really brought to mind the presentation from Professor Schultz earlier this morning on social norms, the huge factor they play, even superseding information that social norms play in decision making. And then finally, the 53% say they ate the diet for less than a year. In terms of what motivates current vegetarians or vegans, number 1 on the list was health, right alongside it, 1% lower animal protection. You get into some environmental considerations, so it's really those, the big 3 motivators that you would guess. In the survey they got into, what were the motivators for the people who were formerly vegetarian and now aren't, and they found that the only major motivation, the one that really stuck out, was health. And so I found that to be an interesting conclusion, that the thing that was more self-interest motivated in terms of health as opposed to social, environmental, those types of things, was a primary motivator and was something that was easier to shed and overcome and return back to a non-vegetarian diet. So the Humane Research Council published some guidance about what are the recommendations for people who want to promote vegetarianism and bring people back into the fold. And they have these ideas about targeted outreach, increasing the focus on how you can be a vegetarian, diversifying your message about why you can be a vegetarian. And so they have these guidelines that they've published. And the next thing I wanted to kind of talk about is a company that is not doing any of this. They're doing the exact opposite with the new product they just launched called the Beast. And so who's heard of the Beast? We've got a few people in the room. Just launched. I mean, became available in Whole Foods last month. What it is, it's a plant-based burger. It's got more protein than beef, more omegas than salmon, chock full of all sorts of other nutrients. It's gluten-free, it's soy-free, it's cholesterol-free. I mean, it's a champion on a lot of different levels. And so I read an interview in Outside Magazine with the CEO, and in that interview, they taste tested the Beast, and the person asked me, "How do you get it to taste so meat-like?" He responded, "Because it's meat." And so in reading a little bit more about the Beast and how it's created, they have a tool, it's called the extruder. And the way the extruder works is they feed in plant-based material, it pulls all this plant-based material apart and then reassembles it into fibrous protein material. And so he said, that's my steer, that's my cow, the extruder that turns the peas and other plant-based protein into protein. And so in that article, they had another statistic saying that livestock, in consuming plant-based materials, turn about 3% of that into muscle during their lifetime. So much less efficient than the extruder and the Beast process. But anyhow, here is the CEO of Beyond Meat. He can't even stop eating a burger for the photo apparently. His name's Ethan Brown, and he's in his 40s. Some of his backstory, he became a vegan in his 20s. And he said it wasn't an emotional decision at all. In his mind, it was a matter of fairness, but it was based around animal welfare. And he had this vision in his 20s that he just wanted to displace McDonald's. He wanted the plant-based McDonald's to become the new social norm. He ended up working in the renewable energy field and on fuel cells and some other things for a number of years until the late 2000s when he started to encounter all this information about climate change and the role that dietary choices play in climate change. And that then became the catalyst for him to go, you know what, I'm jumping back into the food sector. The impact's huge. Renewables are great, but I'm jumping right back into food. And so he did so, and he started the company Beyond Meat in 2009. It's grown in popularity over time with their baked chicken products and their beef crumbles, and now with the Beast. One of the investors in the company is Bill Gates. And in the Outside Magazine article, Bill Gates talks just about the food sector in general and how ripe it is for reinvention. The food sector's stuck. It's not doing things the right way, the most efficient way. And in looking at the Beast, he gave advice to Ethan. He said, if you can make it cheaper than beef, you're going to win. You're going to win. You're using less land, less water, less energy, doing it in less time, more healthy. How could you lose? And so that's kind of the model of the Beast. We'll see where it goes. I'm curious to see what the uptake is with it. But just in my mind, if you've got a food product that is more healthy, it is providing all the protein and all the other deliverables that beef is, that costs less, and that's just generally available to consumers, I don't see how it's going to be held back. And not only that, I think if they can get the cost component correct, they're going to turn a lot of the big corporate chain restaurants into their own marketing machine. I mean, what McDonald's is going to really turn away a product that's increasing their profit margin and becoming more widely available to them. And so that's kind of the vision with the product. I hadn't had the Beast until last night, and so I cooked it up. That's my attempt on the skillet. Here's the final product. And so it was quite the experience. I put some olive oil on the skillet and threw it on there, and literally when I flipped the thing, flames shot up. It was like a Burger King commercial, and it set off a fire alarm in my condo. and the beast just really took over. But in terms of how it tasted, I burned the outside. I think cooking on a grill is easier, less surface covers, that type of thing. But the inside was chewy. It was great. It was rich. So if you get a chance, grab the beast, and I guess my recommendation would be to cook it on a grill. So with that, back to Bridget.
I should stress that Tyler is not employed by the beast nor receiving any. So he's pretty excited about it. So I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the pivotal moments in terms of our agricultural policy, because if I gave you any more than that, you would be pretty bored. So I want to start about a little over 80 years ago and talk about what happened around shortly after the Depression and the Dust Bowl. So basically, that was when we first started to see government taking a more active role in agriculture. And what had happened was there was increased mechanization, and because of that, there was really intensive plowing and farming of the arid grassland region of the United States and Canada. And as a result of that intensive farming and removing the one thing that was keeping all of the dust in place, what happened was a huge dust bowl, and it lasted throughout most of the 30s. And there was a couple of things that also happened that helped to influence policy. One of which was, because of that intensive agriculture, there was a surplus of products. The other thing was that surplus of products was getting into the market and skewing prices. And because of the soil erosion and the other ecological impacts that were happening, it was damaging the future of the food system and actually the present at that time as well. So they started what was called the Agricultural Investment Act, and basically what that laid the groundwork for was our subsidy program. It started to include corn and wheat back then, and also the government trying to control the fluctuations of price so that they might avoid another depression. So the next pivotal moment came in World War II. We, instead of a surplus, we had such a high demand for producing food for our troops and to feed ourselves that it was again affecting the market. And there was so much production happening during this time period. I mean, this is the time of Victory Gardens, right, where we had 2 million gardens throughout the U.S., and they were producing 40% of our food supply. So this was a really productive time in agriculture. But because the demand was going to be sustainable, like after the war was wrapping up, the government started to worry about the fact that that sharp decline in demand was all of a sudden going to cause another market crash. So subsidies were again increased after World War II, and the mechanization that happened during this time period also helped move towards more industrialized agriculture. The next pivotal moment would be the Green Revolution of the 60s. This is when there were some real huge innovations in chemical fertilizer, and the Green Revolution, the whole point of it was to actually try to modernize agriculture globally to reduce famine. And so what we saw was this whole theme of go big or leave. What we want agricultural to be is highly productive, intensive. We have all these resources you can use to grow more food, and then we're going to conquer hunger. What really happened was that we ended up with a surplus again, so we had to increase subsidies. And we had a surplus of commodity crops. So the way that ties into what we're looking at in terms of how food recommendations have come into play is that those gluts in our system, or I should say those surpluses, started to infiltrate the way that we were told to eat. Like especially in 1984, we go from four recommended servings of grains to 6 to 11 in the 80s. Kind of a big jump. I don't know who can eat 11 servings of grains either. That's kind of ridiculous. And you see that to continue. I'm sorry, I don't know why that quote is right there. But essentially, you see that continue, and every time the government tried to shift, or I should say the panel that does our U.S. dietary guidelines tried to adjust that, there would be huge pushback from both the commodities lobby and the meat producers. And so what's interesting that's happening now, and I don't know how many people have heard about this, is that we're seeing a shift again. And this is the first time ever in this new report that we've seen the advisory committee actually look at the environmental impact and greenhouse gas emissions of our food. And they're encouraging people to eat less meat. In fact, they say the current evidence shows that the average U.S. diet has a larger environmental impact in terms of increased greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and energy use. This is because the current U.S. population intake of animal-based foods is higher and plant-based foods are lower. And that's true. The average person is not getting their recommended intake of fruits and vegetables. In fact, when we did our community food assessment, we found that only around 30% of people were actually eating the recommended intake of vegetables and fruit. So now we're going to lead into the take action section, and it's just really highlighting some of the key takeaways for this. And one of them is eat less meat and dairy. And when you eat meat, try to choose more low carbon options. As you can see, there's a range of emissions impacts based on the type of food product. So keep that in mind as you're making choices. Eat more plants, and I would say if you can, grow as many of those plants as possible. And choose organic whenever you can. In terms of the impacts of organic, if we were to shift our current cropland used for conventional agriculture to organic, we would see a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We'd almost completely eliminate nitrogen pollution. So something to really keep in mind. Waste less. 20% of meat's greenhouse gas emissions come from waste. Just ignore that typo up there afterward. And really, if you look at how much food we're wasting, it's around 40%. So I would say try and do meal planning, figure out how you can eat or take as much food as you're going to eat so that you're creating a lot less waste. Cook smart. Some of our footprint actually comes from the refrigeration and cooking of products. So some good ideas I've heard are to actually plan more of a weekly menu, and so that you're able to cook a big batch of something once, use less energy, and eat that throughout the course of the week. And then speak out. As you can see, we've got some pretty rough agricultural policy. So we need to hit that from all angles. We need to be talking about it at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And there's a lot of great ways to engage. And in fact, Environmental Working Group also has some key ways to engage politically to help this conversation continue. I think with that, we'll let you guys talk and ask us questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I wanted to clarify because on the food pyramid slide that you showed, so just before that, the panel, next one, that quote that you have there, that's on 2 slides.
Sorry.
That one.
This one, yes, sorry.
That quote. So I heard that they got in trouble for saying that,
We did.
and so now there's some sort of unrest about this. So one side of the fence is saying, yes, this has an environmental impact and being recognized. And then there's another side of the fence that's trying to slow it down.
Yeah, and do you know which side of the fence is trying to slow it down? It's essentially the same that has created the other issues. The meat lobby is really upset with it. And even the commodities lobby is super upset because obviously they're producing food for our meat. So we'll see if this actually comes into stronger policy or if this is just something that slowly gets eroded because it's a huge political battle to start talking about this. Is there anything you wanted to add about regulation or to that? Okay. Other questions?
I have a question. So I'm working currently with at the University of Utah, and I'm interested to hear what sort of pushback you've gotten in terms of working within the Utah and Salt Lake communities in terms of working on more sustainable food issues, and what sorts of pushback you've gotten from any not necessarily specific groups, but just any pushback you've had from other interest groups?
Because of the areas that we've been focusing on, we haven't gotten much pushback. We essentially are trying to promote a sustainable food system, more diversified small-scale agriculture, supporting local farmers, and a lot of that resonates really well in Salt Lake City. We haven't worked much outside of Salt Lake City, and we haven't started. This is kind of our first step in trying to really talk about diet. Where before that's been a little bit taboo, and anytime we brought that up, there's been an immediate pushback, and people's response is kind of, this is my personal choice, or they start like, well, actually, I don't, how do you know that vegan's soy burger isn't more than my burger? Or there's a lot of infighting, which I think is incredibly detrimental because we're all fighting the industrial food system. So what we need to be talking about more is a low carbon diet and less about vegan or omnivore or locavore, just really looking at everything through that lens of low carbon.
So would you say that, because I saw at the beginning of the slide there where it said like a locavore will only save like so much compared to like a meat, dairy-free diet. So are there any sort of like substantial arguments that say at least partially locally sourced diet is going to be more less carbon intense, or?
Well, I think there's a lot of benefits to sourcing locally, and they were touched on a little bit earlier by David Orr in terms of those economic impacts and the multiplier effect. And the other really great thing about dealing locally with your food system is that there's accountability. When you go to the farmer's market and you're dealing with a farmer, you can talk to them about their agricultural practices. And you can say, I really want to support you, but I don't really want anything with pesticides. What are you doing to use less? Or, just really have more of a conversation and then influence the local agricultural system as well. So I think it's the most accessible way to start addressing local shifts. And in that way, you can make some pretty dramatic changes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But you have to be careful too, obviously, on what products you're consuming stuff. Do you have a question, Peter?
Yeah, I guess maybe just sort of your thoughts or Tyler's thoughts on how education in just prepping food and the habit of prepping food at home and cooking your own food as opposed to eating out, because I feel like one thing that really influences our diets isn't necessarily us going to a grocery store and saying, well, I'm going to have steak versus salad. It's the restaurants that you walk into, and I think more and more people eat out as opposed to prepping their food at home.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you're just kind of at the mercy of whatever restaurant you walk into. And I think that certainly influences when I eat out, whether I'm going to eat something vegetarian or that has meat in it. So I'm just curious to know if you find any correlation between that, or just your thoughts on how education and how to prep a vegetarian diet affects.
Definitely. And I know Tyler has something he might want to say about that as well. I'll just say quickly that I think that it's the key is obviously having time. And if you're working, that's hard. So one of the things that I do is, I try to prep stuff on the weekend when I do have time. And then, did you want to talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a personal perspective, like my transition with food was initiated by climate concerns, and so the first thing that I looked to eliminate was red meat from my diet and just use other forms of meat. And then over time, went vegetarian, and my diet is very highly concentrated in substitute type meat products. So I'm eating the beef crumble, faux beef crumble, spaghettis, and the tacos and that type of thing. And so it's very accessible once you try to do it. And, I don't think I think it's a good thing if even you're taking some traditional recipes and just throwing in these types of substitute type meat products. But Bridget has a different approach and a much more evolved approach, I guess, to her personal diet and food than I do.
We incorporate a lot of beans and stuff as our primary protein, beans, nuts, and seeds, and we buy those all in bulk so that we have them on hand. And we're just routinely soaking beans we have some available to be cooking so that they're easy to throw in. They become an easy protein source, and nuts and seeds are super easy too. So I think there's ways to do it if you set up your pantry to make it easy for you, but taking that first step to kind of bring all those things together and then thinking creatively about meal planning. And it doesn't have to be too elaborate, salad with nuts and seeds, maybe grain.
And when you're eating out, the menu may reflect that you don't have many options, but in reality, you have a lot more options than you may think. In that, the meat type entrees are great and consumable, and that's generally ordering. So don't be limited by what you find on the menu.
And I would just say when you do go out to eat, ask about the food and ask where it's coming from, so that restaurateurs know that that's important to you and start thinking about it more and more. And do that at your grocery store too. Do you have a question?
I was just going to comment on the question about local food. So I've seen that in Carnegie, before. And it's showing that the transportation is quite small. So it's not like it's impact. But one thing, there's all sorts of papers that follow that, and they look at packaging, if that's included, then that changes it a little bit. Also, if it's depending on how it's transported matters. Also, there's a certain way that local diversified food is more appropriate for the local market. Because if you grow a bunch of like a big monoculture or something, you necessarily growing for a broad market, so it's going to travel farther. And that type of agriculture is more energy intensive. So if you diversify your farm, then you're going to be directing your food locally. So there's a kind of a way that the production end is connected to the how far it travels. Does that, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Probably not.
Um,